let me introduce you to today's speaker. Robert Ryals is a member of the Lancaster 250th Committee and a public historian who holds a master's in history and a master's of science in information studies. He's worked as an archivist and possesses 15 years combined experience as a living history interpreter, reenactor, speaker, and performer. And today we are honored to have him talk about Reverend William Martin. So please join me in welcoming him up.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. This is an incredible turnout. I love this. It's so wonderful to see people that are interested in their history, but also the American Revolutionary War history. I mean, this year marks the beginning of an ongoing celebration of the 250-year anniversary of the American Revolution in our country. And I was a small kid. I remember the bicentennial and how exciting that was. But this year is really remarkable because it is an ongoing celebration that is going to continue from 1775 to 2030, 2031, 2032. It's just going to be a wonderful opportunity for all of us here in South Carolina and beyond to learn more about the war. And before I get started in the introduction, I think it's also important to point out that the inspiration for delving into the biography of the subject today, Reverend William Martin, came from the academic work done by the late Michael Scoggins, the late historian of Yorktown, South Carolina. In 2014, Mike Scoggins co-wrote this book, The Great Awakening and Southern Backcountry Revolutionaries, an academic work published by Springer, in which Mike really characterizes the American Revolution in South Carolina as also a religious war. And in this book, chapter 5 of this book, he discusses in brief some of the different Scotch-Irish Presbyterian ministers in the backcountry who were either arrested, interrogated, or harassed by British forces because of the notorious reputation of Presbyterian ministers as being the stirrers of the sedition, and Presbyterian meeting houses being houses of sedition, right? And in this account, this work, chapter 5, Michael included a mention about Reverend Martin in a very dramatic sermon that, according to anecdotal accounts, he performed in the year 1780 in the wake of the Battle of Waxhaws, also known as Buford's Massacre. So thank you, Mike. The American Revolution is filled with individual stories, narratives, anecdotal accounts that fall outside the scope of battles, skirmishes, logistics, movement of armies, which form the details of military history. The American Revolution was also a war that significantly disrupted the daily lives and routines of civilians who were not directly involved in the fighting. And in some cases, these civilians were affected by the consequences of their own actions to support one side or the other, or in some cases, both sides. These civilians included influential voices of dissent who paid the price for expressing their convictions. And one of those voices was that of Reverend William Martin, Martin was a devout Ulster-Scot Presbyterian minister. And he was a recently arrived immigrant from Northern Ireland to the South Carolina backcountry in 1772. Ulster-Scots, also referred to as the Scotch-Irish, as we know, were a distinct cultural group of people with Scottish ancestral lineage who had migrated from Lower Scotland to the border counties of Northern England, Northern Ireland, and eventually to the American colonies between the 17th and 18th centuries, and even beyond. They were united as a distinct cultural group through their common religion as members of the Presbyterian faith, and through their shared historical experiences as a persecuted and marginalized group of people. Many Ulster-Scots immigrated to the American colonies during the 18th century due to the economic pressures of living in Northern Ireland. Many of them also immigrated to seek religious freedom and to escape the authority not only of the British Crown, but of the Anglican Church. In 1772, Reverend Martin brought over 1,000 Ulster-Scots with him to South Carolina for these reasons. Some were from his own congregation in County Antrim, and some he recruited. They crossed the Atlantic in 5 ships, landed in Charlestown, and applied for and received generous land grants. Nearly all of them settled in small communities scattered throughout the Camden, New Acquisition, 96, and Spartan districts of the backcountry. Martin and his family settled in the Rocky Creek community, a rural area in present-day Chester County, located just a few miles northwest of present-day Great Falls. He was pastor of Catholic Presbyterian Church for about a year, and then he established his own church for Presbyterian Covenanters just 2 miles away. Probably thinking, Covenanters, who were the Covenanters? Well, the Covenanters were considered a radical sect by the British, of course, a radical sect of the Presbyterian faith, who were descendants of Presbyterians who had been persecuted and killed in the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. As a persecuted group, they possessed very zealous beliefs about the authority of their Presbyterian faith, and they held a very bitter resentment against the English monarchy and the English bureaucracy and government. And they clung to those beliefs for over a century and carried them with them when they immigrated to the American colonies. Martin was a prominent religious leader among them in Northern Ireland, and then he continued that tradition when he settled in South Carolina. Martin's life was carefully documented and published by 3 19th century historians. 2 of them, Monthal Glasgow and George Howe, documented the history of the Presbyterian Church in South Carolina. The third was Elizabeth Elliot, who published a 3-volume compilation of oral traditions, family stories, and legends told by women who lived during the Revolutionary era. Glasgow and Howe actually borrowed the most dramatic accounts of Martin's life, submitted from an account by Nancy Green. And this was reported in the 3rd volume of Elliot's work. And though some of the accounts in Elliot's work border on myth-making, she deserves a lot of credit for giving women a voice at a time when women had no voice. Also, a lot of credit goes to Jean Stevens, a 20th century genealogist who conducted extensive research about Martin's biographical background in Ireland. She also compiled an exhaustive list of the immigrants who were part of Martin's entourage. those who were awarded land grants in the backcountry. Her work, published in 1970, has been a valuable resource for researchers tracing their family connections from colonial South Carolina to Northern Ireland. So today's program is a storytelling experience, which was inspired by the historical research and anecdotal accounts about Martin. However, it is also an exercise in critical thinking. Some of the details in this scripted account are based on conjecture. Martin didn't keep a personal diary or autobiography, so his personal thoughts and any other sentiments or emotions are speculative at best in this presentation. Also, there's no historical evidence that he met or encountered any men from his congregation who presumably were interred in the jail at Camden. So, naturally, you may be thinking to yourself, who is this guy blending fact with fiction? Well, again, I took this approach for three primary reasons. Number one, this 45-minute version of Martin's life requires details for continuity and dramatic storytelling purposes. We all love a good story, but even the most well-documented diaries, autobiographies, biographies, and other accounts of a person's life do not necessarily include all of the details or the emotional experience of that person's life. Number two, on the opposite side of the spectrum, some autobiographical programs told in a first-person voice requires us to look beyond the sometimes sketchy historical details of that person's life and their life experiences, especially if they are solely derived from other people's historical accounts. Martin, again, didn't keep a diary or any type of autobiographical account of his life. So a contextual, empathetic approach, in other words, how would you feel if this happened to you kind of approach, humanizes and brings to life somewhat sketchy historical figures. And then the third reason, taking this approach creates an opportunity for a thought-provoking exercise in critical thought and analysis. As you listen to today's program, challenge yourself to think and to distinguish between what seems to be historical fact, what is an anecdotal account, and what is speculative. And then at the end, feel free to question or challenge me. At the end, I will be truthful in all circumstances. That's why I'm wearing the clothes. So the opening scene of this program begins with Reverend Martin himself sharing his memories about appearing before Lord Cornwallis on the day of his court-martial at Windsboro. It's intended to be a bit of a cliffhanger. Will he be pardoned, or will he lose his life? And then the remainder of the program concludes a biographical account of his life experiences, including that very dramatic year of 1780, a very tumultuous time in South Carolina. So let us now turn and allow Reverend Martin to tell his story. I spent the past 6 months of my life in chains, running away in the jail at Camden, and my friend committing acts of sedition and treason against the government of His Majesty, King George III. In December of 1780, I and others who were imprisoned there were sent north to Winnsboro, the winter encampment of Lord Cornwallis. 70 of us were detained there, and their crimes? Violating their paroles and taking up arms against His Majesty's government in defense of their own lives, property, and country. We awaited our fate. Certainly, the court-martial we faced would certainly result in a death sentence for us all. Our day of judgment finally came. It was at the noon hour on a cold and dreary day. I was kneeling in prayer with Lieutenant Minor Wynn behind a woodpile. You see, Minor was the son of Colonel John Wynn of the Fairfield district. Both father and son were men of prominence, strident leaders of the Whig resistance. They had taken up arms against the Loyalists when all seemed lost. My prayer with Minor was interrupted by a soldier's footsteps. He came towards me, looked down on me with a scowl on his face. He bent down, grabbed my arm, and violently hoisted me up from the cold ground. The others received the same rough treatment. I resisted the urge to strike him. No good would come from it. And then we were marched in a column under the scrutiny of armed guards. The soldiers in camp held us along the way. And then I looked to the opposite side of the camp, the gallows. Would I be swinging from a hangman's noose? We turned and entered the general's tent, and I was the first to be presented before his lordship, the first to be sentenced. My name is Reverend William Martin, child, Ulster, Presbyterian Covenanter, and patriot for liberty and freedom. And this is my story. I was born the eldest son of David Martin on the 16th of May, in the year of our Lord 1729, County Antrim. What a beautiful country it was. When I came of age, I attended the University of Glasgow. And those were the days when my mind was opened. My power of learning was at its peak. Books, reading, Greek, Latin, rhetoric, and logic. And after graduation, I pursued the vocation of the ministry and entered the seminary. I studied under Reverend John McMillan, a no-nonsense professor with a very sharp tongue and stern expression. He was intimidating. But he was a great influence on my theological understanding and studies, and I can still hear the sharp tone of his voice. The National Covenant was an oath signed and sworn by our Scottish ancestors in the 17th century. It was a pledge to uphold the Church of Scotland and our Presbyterian system of church governance. He was a stern one. None of us ever dared to blink an eye or give the impression that we were destructive. We all feared him, especially when he talked in such anger about the Solemn League and Covenant. The Solemn League and Covenant was a political agreement made between our Scottish ancestors and the English Parliament during the English Civil War. Our ancestors pledged military support to aid the English Parliament in their war against the Papists and the Royalists who supported the English monarchy. In exchange for that support, the English pledged to reform their system of governance and model it after our old Presbyterian system. It would have established a civil and religious union of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But our ancestors were betrayed with the monarchy, and the power of the Anglican Church was restored under King Charles II. Our ancestors would not submit to the authority of the Anglican Church, and this led to the killing times. Our ancestors were persecuted and martyred, akin to the early Christians of ancient Rome. We were not altogether eliminated. Many of our ancestors fled Scotland during the killing times and fled to Ulster as religious exiles. Scots without a country, but our numbers were greatly reduced. We persisted and survived despite our dwindling numbers. My Covenanting forefathers fled to Northern Ireland during the killing time and held hope that they could renew their lives. They wanted a better life. A life free from persecution by the English crown and the Anglican Church. And we are their descendants, the Covenanters. We never forgot those persecutions. It was our shared history as Ulster-Scots. In 1756, I graduated and returned to County Antrim. And the next year, I was ordained as the first minister of the Presbyterian Covenanters sect in Ireland. And it was one of the proudest moments of my life. I devoted the next 15 years of my life cultivating our fledgling Covenanter societies, and our numbers grew, and soon we had 2 large congregational districts. But over time, it was apparent that the social order of all Ulster-Scots in Ireland was in great peril. Many hoped that Ulster would be a land of opportunity, but instead, it turned into a land of struggle, poverty, and gloom. You see, our ancestors were a mixed bunch. We all arrived as religious refugees, but some were affluent. Some had the resources to acquire lands at great expense in Ulster. And then there were those who were poor, and the poor had to settle on tenant lands owned by greedy British landlords. And the landlords charged high tenant rents. Over time, the tenant rents increased, and soon evictions from tenant homes were becoming more and more common, and so was the poverty. And in '68, Lord Donegal raised the rent so high that only a few were able to pay. Many more forced evictions, homeless families, hopelessness, large numbers of roving bands wandering throughout the countryside, gypsies with no place to settle. And the social order for all Ulster-Scots was threatened. What had been hoped for as a land of opportunity turned into a land of constant struggle, poverty. Action needed to be taken. And this began a long exodus for my people. Many left Ulster in droves. They settled in the American colonies. That's where they were granted the opportunity to own land, not rent it. And we would do the same. In the early months of '72, I received a call. It was for a pastoral position in the back country of South Carolina. It was in the Rocky Creek district in Craven County, within the Camden district. I met with some of the colonial agents in Ireland and learned that South Carolina indeed offered the most generous type of land bounty. The first 100 acres of land was granted to the head of the family. And then each additional family member was entitled to another 50 acres of land. Very generous. No tenant rents. Freedom to worship as we pleased. This was the sign that I needed. And I accepted their call and persuaded many in my congregation to join me in this new endeavor, this new adventure in a land far and away. During the year, we pooled our resources to pay for the cost of the voyage and recruited others outside the congregation to join us. And that fall, we commissioned 5 ships the Lord Dunmers, the Hopewell, the Pennsylvania Farmer, the Freemason, and the James and Mary. And we set our course south by southwest to Charlestown. By my estimates, there were over 1,000 souls on that voyage. It included men who would fight just 3 years later as Whigs during the war. My wife, Jeanette, daughter Nancy, and I were aboard the Lord Dunmers, along with our close friends and elders from my congregation. Our trip was plagued by foul weather which caused delays, and there was an outbreak of smallpox that claimed the lives of 5 children. But by divine providence, none of our ships was lost at sea, and we all arrived at Charlestown as we settled. We were all sent to Sullivan's Island and held in quarantine. We had to prevent the spread of pox, this deadly and obnoxious disease. Also, there were a number of German speakers who arrived before us. We would have to wait our turn in the queue, but fortunately the delay was short. That January of 1703, I appeared before the council and presented our petitions for the land grants. And this marked the beginning of our new lives. Not all of us who were friends and neighbors back in Ireland would settle together. Some acquired lands near the Cherokee, and this created some unease. But most of us settled in the Camden and 96 districts. My wife, Jeanette, daughter Nancy, and I received 400 acres of land in the Rocky Creek neighborhood. Our land bordered along Fishing Creek. There were some tearful goodbyes, but as a whole, we were content to be as far away as possible from the yoke of those greedy British landlords and the authority of the Church of England. We were all blessed. We owned land. Our closest neighbors were John and Mary Gossett and David McKesty. David served as an elder in my congregation from Ireland, and not far from us was Thomas McDill, another elder. Both men assisted me with the first communion that I will perform at my new church, Catholic Presbyterian Church. Mind you, this was not a Catholic church. There were no Catholic papists in our congregation. It was established and named by my predecessors as a union church for the various sects of the Presbyterian faith. It served as a house of worship by Covenanters, Old Lights, New Lights, the Cedars, Burgers, Anti-Burgers, and later the Associate Reformed. My predecessor, Reverend William Richardson, had a large following there. Indeed, he was well respected. His home and meeting house was in the Waxhaw settlement to the north. He had established Catholic and several other churches of the Presbyterian faith throughout the Camden district and beyond. He served as their supply pastor. And though he was English by birth, I am convinced that he was an ardent patriot at heart. It was a bit sad to me knowing that Richardson would not live to see the independence of our country. But he had a nephew named William Richardson Davey, who became a prominent military leader of the Whigs during the war. Richardson would have been proud of his nephew's role in the struggle. Fortunately, many families with Ulster roots had settled in the area as early as the 1750s, and we were blessed to have received their assistance. Some had migrated from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. They migrated to South Carolina to escape the Indian troubles during the French and Indian War. Some were Covenanters who had migrated from Virginia. They followed Reverend Alexander Craig, who had converted to the Covenanter sect. and who had arrived in Mecklenburg County. Others continued south into the Wax Mills, and like Richardson, Craighead had planted seeds of rebellion against the authority of the Anglican Church. And like Richardson, he did not live to see the fruits of his labors, freedom from the tyranny of the Anglican Church. But I digress. And this is what happens when an old man's idle thoughts start to wander. From 73 to 74, I served at Catholic and also served as a supply pastor at the meeting house on Jackson's Creek in the Fairfield district. And I was reunited with old friends from Ireland who had settled there. In 74, I and other Covenanters split from Catholic and established our own church at Lucky Creek. That church was located on a beautiful ridge. I can still see the men felling the trees, shaping the timbers with their broad axes, placing the timbers one by one on top of each other. Our own temple of worship. We were indeed far and away from Ireland. And we were far enough from Charlestown. But we were aware of the troubles brewing in the colonies. As for us, we simply wanted to be left alone. We wanted to live our lives in peace, with no outside interference. After our arrival, I learned why the land grants in the backcountry were so generous. You see, the backcountry was a dangerous place. A history of problems with Cherokee uprisings, roving bands of lawless men, problems ignored by the Colonial Assembly in Charlestown. These problems forced prominent men in the backcountry to regulate their own affairs, to establish peace and order. Many were embittered that they did not receive the aid and support from the Low Country. Indeed, selling in the backcountry was a very risky proposition. But there was no turning back. This was our new home. I recall the day in 75 when I learned about the bloodshed at Lexington. We received the news a month later and disregarded it, regarding this as a problem for those in Massachusetts. And if it did become a problem in South Carolina, certainly the elites in Charlestown would deal with it. I was never so wrong about anything ever in my life. You see, the backcountry was divided when the war began. And this was especially true in the 96th district. Thomas Fletcher, Thomas Brown, the Cunningham brothers, and Moses Kirkland were recruiting and organizing loyalists. These were the leaders who distrusted the Low Country elites in Charlestown, the same colonial elites who disregarded the problems of the backcountry for so many years. These were the same colonial elites who established a new revolutionary government. The Provincial Congress and the Committee of Safety, nothing had changed. The leaders of the backcountry were now content to regulate their own affairs, and they persuaded their friends and neighbors to their cause. Loyalist sentiment was also encouraged by Reverend Philip Mulkey, a Baptist of a large congregation in the Fair Forest community. And in 75, the Provincial Congress tried to persuade, often by very forceful means, that the loyalists in the backcountry had to swear an oath of loyalty to the Provincial Congress. This oath was called the Association. The Provincial Congress dispatched a special expedition to persuade backcountry men to sign it. The leaders of this expedition included William Drake, William Tennant III, and Auburn Hart. All of them were of Low Country. Drayton was a prominent Whig in the provincial Congress, a loyalist and patriot. Tennant was the minister of the Congregational Church in Charlestown, but the descendant of a very proud Presbyterian family, men of the cloth. And Hart was a humble minister of the Baptist denomination, a leading Baptist in South Carolina. Their efforts were only partially successful. Tennant traveled through the Craven District and stopped in Rocky Creek on the 13th of August. I'll never forget what an incredible and persuasive orator he was. He preached from Mark chapters 4 and 20 before hundreds who lived in this area. And then he apologized for having to bring up the subject of politics on the Lord's Day. But he emphasized the importance of it. He harangued them for quite some time, about 2 hours, I believe. And by the end of his speech, he nearly melted from the summer heat. But his work bore fruit. Several men who were there eagerly signed the association document, being fully convinced of the necessity of it. And it was a very powerful and declarative oath. I recall the association pledge, the actual commencement of hostilities against this continent, the threats of arbitrary imposition from abroad, and the dread of instigated insurrections at home are causes sufficient to drive and impress people to the use of arms. We, therefore, the subscribers and inhabitants of this unhappy colony, holding ourselves bound by that most sacred of all obligations, the duty of good citizens towards an injured country, and thoroughly convinced that under our present distressed circumstances, we shall be justified before God and man in resisting force by force, do unite ourselves under every tie of religion and of honor and associate as a band in her defense against every foe. And we do solemnly promise that whenever her continental and provincial councils shall decree it necessary, we will go forth and be ready to sacrifice our lives and fortunes in attempting to secure her freedom and safety. Well, beautiful words, many signatures, but despite their best efforts, the backcountry remained divisive, and it was only a matter of time before the tense divisiveness between loyalists and Whigs led to an outbreak of fighting and violence. It was inevitable, especially when the Loyalists in 96 deliberately defied the authority of the Provincial Congress. That fall in 75, the Cunningham brothers captured a Patriot supply train of powder and lead in the 96th district. The shot and powder were intended for the Cherokee, a peace concession. Well, the Whigs responded. They called on Colonel Richard Richardson to suppress this threat. And Richardson's force captured a large number of Loyalists, including Thomas Fletcher, in December of 75. On a campaign that was known as the Snow Campaign, or the Snow Camps. The problems with the Loyalists had been resolved, or so we thought. But 75 was just the beginning. Good people like John and Margaret Payton from the Spartan district of the 96th district were forced to flee. They came to be among friends in Craven County. John had been an elder in my church back in Ireland. His family had arrived from James and Mary, and like me, he was an older man. He didn't enlist, but his sons Alexander and Samuel did. And after the war, I learned that he had enlisted in the Spartan district, in their regiment, and they helped to put down the Loyalist uprisings during the Snow Campaign. And other men who had sailed with us from Ireland were part of that same expedition, Thomas Boggs, John Brown, John Craig, James Hood, John Kirkpatrick, and Henry Ray. These men also served in battles in our neighborhood during the summer of 1780. In 76, the British attempted to take General Moultrie's Palmetto Fort on Sullivan's Island. It was an attack by sea. Of course, they were unsuccessful. And then came the raids by the Cherokee that same year. We were all in danger in the backcountry, and a huge effort was made to eradicate the Indian troubles. Such tragedy. Villages burned, crops burned, lives killed, much devastation in the lower Cherokee towns. And then what followed was a very strange lull in the fighting, a reprieve from the tempest, and none of us were prepared for the onslaught of terror, violence, and murder that would follow. That tempest of the War of the Backcountry came on the 29th of May in the year of our Lord 1780, a time of toil and strife. On that day, Colonel Abraham Buford and his Continental Army of Virginians and Marylanders faced off against the British Legion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton. Buford took his stand at a meadow in the Waxhaws just off the Camden Road. And what ensued was a bloody and merciless slaughter of men. Buford's men cried out for mercy and quarter as they surrendered at Cottonwood. Instead, they were cut down by British bayonets and sabers. 113 of Buford's men killed. A devastating sight to behold. The stares of cold, pale faces. Another 250 or so, either wounded, captured, or missing. Those who were wounded were taken by wagon to the Waxhaw meeting house nearby. And a chorus of the moans and screams of wounded and dying men were heard. And this battle forever sealed Tarleton's reputation as a ruthless and cold-hearted murderer. Buford's massacre. He shot everyone in the backcountry. A type of brutality not witnessed in our neighborhoods until that day. Certainly a demoralizing blow to humanity and a blow to our struggle for freedom. Even some Whig leaders thought the war might be drawing to a close. In Craven County, Captain John McClure had just returned from the Low Country, and they vowed not to submit or surrender to our enemies. And on the 7th of June, he and his men attacked Tories at Alexander's Old Fields. And then 2 days later, men under the command of McClure, Major John Wynn and Colonel William Bratton attacked Tories at Molly's Meeting House in the Fairfield district. At the same time, the British had issued proclamations. They promised peace and protection to those who would lay down their arms and take the oath of loyalty to the king. False promises, a wicked ruse. There was no British protection, only brutality. Taking the loyalty oath resulted in the plundering of people's homes and possessions, war material needed to ensure the king's protection, forced enlistment into royalist militias, fighting against friends and neighbors. And those who defied British authority suffered the most punitive consequences. And in the aftermath of the Battle of the Waxhaws, also known as Buford's Massacre, some men were angered and wanted to take up arms against the British. Some were possessed with fear and considered taking the king's protection. The controversy of the vow became the subject of the day, and it was the topic of a sermon that I preached on Sunday, the 11th of June. I will never forget that morning. I rode my horse to the meeting house, and my thoughts were immersed in the content of the sermon I would preach that day. From a great distance, I saw the crowd of people assembled there. The whole neighborhood had turned out. The service would have to be conducted outside in the open air. I paused for a moment and took in the scene. People were clustered in small groups under the shade trees in every direction. Some were talking with loud and angry voices. They stomped the ground as they spoke. Others wore pleading expressions on their faces. They talked to anyone who would listen. And then there were the ones who were alone, the solitary figures. Some were sitting on the ground, staring. They were pale, full of fear and apprehension. Others were standing, and I recognized one of them. It was Mr. Montgomery, a local schoolmaster. He was also observing the scene. And then there were strangers there I did not recognize. With the hour of 11 o'clock drawing near, I advanced closer to the crowd. Their incessant chatter drowned in my ears, and then their faces turned, their voices ceased, and the crowd parted like the waters of the Red Sea. I'm certainly no Moses, but it's the only way I know how to describe that memory. I dismounted from my horse and tied the reins from the bridle to the hitching post, and by then all of the voices had ceased. And the only noise that could be heard was the sound of rustling footsteps as people began to seat themselves on the ground. The elders retrieved the lectern from my use. It was a very solemn occasion, and the sermon I delivered that day was the most important I had ever delivered. We began with a prayer and singing of the psalms, and then I began the sermon addressing the subject on the minds of everyone. I cited many passages from Scripture to show that a people may lawfully resist wicked rulers. I pointed to historical examples of princes trampling on people's rights. I painted in vivid colors the rise and progress of the Reformation. And finally, I introduced the subject of the Revolution in America. I gave a brief account of the events of the war, from the first shedding of blood at Lexington up to our present circumstances. And at the end of the sermon, I summarized my main points, and I reminded my congregation about the persecution of our Scottish ancestors by the English. I used the recent battle at the Waxhaws as an example of our continuing persecution and oppression. At times, I struck the lectern with a clenched fist and encouraged them to fight. My hearers, talk and angry words will do no good. We must fight. Sorely have our countrymen been dealt with, too forced to the declaration of their independence and the pledge of their lives and sacred honor to support it. Our forefathers in Scotland swore an oath to uphold and defend the Presbyterian Church. It is now our turn, brethren, to maintain this declaration and fight at all hazards. Tender mercies of Great Britain? How? Go see the tender mercies of Great Britain at the Waxhaw Meeting House. In that church, you may find men, though still alive, hacked out of the very semblance of humanity. Some men deprived of their arms, mutilated trunks, some with one arm or leg, and some with both legs cut off. Is not this cruelty a parallel to the history of our own Scottish forefathers who were driven from their meeting spaces and hunted down like wild beasts? My hearers, we must fight it. At the end of the sermon, the congregation responded. Hands and teeth were clenched, and every face expressed the same determination. The women were filled with a fighting spirit. They resolved to do their part. They were determined to plow the fields and gather the crops if need be. And they pledged to fight themselves rather than to submit to our adversaries. Captain Benjamin Lamb was seen walking among the people after the sermon. He was shaking hands with every neighbor and whispering in men's ears about the next day's work. Word was passed that they were to assemble at the muster grounds near Rocky Mountain, and they were to form a company of militia. We were all united in the spirit of that moment. That's what my pride and hubris told me. I was wrong. Some of those strangers who had attended the service were less enthusiastic. They were polite and shook hands, but were non-committal. And unknown to us, there were loyalist spies in our midst, and they would betray us. They had already betrayed others in our neighborhood, including Reverend John Simpson, pastor of the meeting house at Fishing Creek. Simpson had also encouraged members of his congregation to join the resistance, and he too had taken up arms against His Majesty's government. And on the same day that I was delivering my sermon at Rocky Creek, a detachment of British cavalry arrived at Simpson's home. They were a group of New York volunteers under the command of Captain Christian Huck. Their intent was to arrest him, but not finding him there, they burned his home, library, and meeting house out of spite. His wife and children were left homeless. By the way, this was not an aberration of British policy. In '79, they had reduced the Sheldon Church, an Anglican church in the Low Country, to smoldering ashes. Their excuse: it was a place where the resistance stored power and led. Never mind that it was a house of worship, God's house. Major James Weems characterized our holy houses of Presbyterian worship as sedition shops. Weems, perhaps the second most despised British officer in South Carolina after Bannister Tarleton, ordered the burning of the meeting house at Indiantown in the Williamsburg district. But once again, I digress. On the next day, Monday the 12th of June, it was akin to a plague of locusts destroying the country as it was in the time of Moses. Men from my congregation gathered at the muster ground and enlisted in Land's company. They began to drill, but unknown to all of them, they had been betrayed by Montgomery, the schoolmaster turned loyalist. Once again, Huck and his men were dispatched. They killed Land and his men in a surprise attack. Then they killed 6 more men gathered at George Harris's blacksmith shop nearby. And then they came for me. They came to my home. They arrested me, threw me in irons. They threw my wife and daughter out of our house. They plundered it, burned it, and then they burned my church to the ground. They left nothing behind but smoke and ash. I was sent to Rocky Mount, and then to Canada, and it was there where I was detained for the next 6 months of my life. Held in chains like a felon. Because I was a clergyman, I was allowed to speak and pray with my fellow countrymen. And as a man of the cloth, it was my duty to assure these men to have faith that God was on our side and that God would deliver us. But I must confess, there were times when my faith was tested. I had to remind myself to be patient, to trust the Almighty God. For comfort, I meditated on the Lord's Prayer. For mental discipline, I recited Scripture. But during that time, I came to know the true meaning of Proverbs chapter 16, verse 27. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. So, too, are idle thoughts. The devil will play tricks on a man's mind if he becomes bored and undisciplined. And I fell under that spell. At times, I became a prisoner trapped in my own idle thoughts. I had anxious thoughts. What was to be my fate? Would I see my wife and daughter ever again? What about the fate of the other men from my congregation? Would I die an old man's death in prison? Or would I die at the end of a hangman's noose? The answer to that last question came 6 months later, in January of 1781. And I returned to the beginning. After we entered the general's tent, I was the first to be presented before his lordship, the first to be sentenced. There he was, Cornwallis, seated at his desk, reading a paper and scribbling notes in the margin. Here he was, this mighty Goliath, cloaked in an old red English coat, stained with the blood of our kinsmen and countrymen who fought and died. Here he was, the bureaucrat. He lifted his head and gave me a long, hard, and serious stare. And then he spoke. You are charged with preaching from the pulpit. You, an old man and a minister of the gospel of peace, with advocating rebellion against your lawful sovereign, King George III. What have you to say in your defense? What could I say in this matter? This was the man who unleashed Tarleton and Hawk into our neighborhoods. He was responsible for the carnage at Camden. And now this man of war held the fate of my mortal life in his hands. I kept my pride and hubris in check. But in my final hour, I needed to convey the truth of my sentiments. And so I replied, Your Lordship, I am happy to appear before you. For these past 6 months, I have been held in chains for preaching what I believe to be the truth. As to King George, I owe him nothing but goodwill. I am not unacquainted with his private character. I was in Scotland, educated in its literary and theological schools. I was settled in Ireland, where I spent the prime of my days, and emigrated to this country 7 years ago. As a king, he was bound to protect his subjects in the enjoyment of their rights. Protection and allegiance go together, and where the one fails, the other cannot be exacted. The Declaration of Independence is but a reiteration of what our covenanting fathers have always maintained. I am thankful you have given me liberty to speak, and will abide by your pleasure, whatever it may be. His Lordship, Cornwallis, paused for a moment. It seemed he was about to issue a death sentence, but he was interrupted by a provincial officer named Colonel Phillips. And I am confident that God's divine intervention was at hand. Yes, Phillips was a Tory by conviction, but he was a fair-minded man of principle and education. He had also been born in Ireland, and for some reason, his lordship favored him. Phillips bent down and whispered in Cornwallis's ear and warned him to take caution. He told him that if I and the others who were there were to be executed, then 100 or so of His Majesty's loyal subjects will be hung in retaliation. The countenance on Cornwallis's face changed. I was given a reprieve. I was paroled and sent to live in the hive with the other hornets in Mecklenburg County for the duration of the war. God intervenes. He also intervenes in the lives of men who show benevolence. The next year, Phillips was taken prisoner and condemned to the gallows. But the Whigs of the Fairfield district petitioned on his behalf. And instead of a death sentence, Phillips was banished from South Carolina. And now, my friends, I too must depart. You have been very patient, hearing the ramblings of a long-deceased man from a time that is both strange and foreign and unfamiliar. I will simply conclude by saying that I was not a perfect man. I have failed in my heart so many times. Pride and hubris, vengeance in my heart. And I readily admit that I would develop intemperate habits after the war. But I was devoted to my flock and to my faith as a covenanter, Presbyterian to the end. And the dust of my bones has settled in the native soil of my home country of South Carolina. May peace and God be with you all. Thank you.